Tearing your ACL is supposed to be a death sentence for any football player. It's the kind of injury that ends careers and forces athletes to become a shadow of what they once were. But for Adrian Peterson, it did the opposite. Because somehow, what should have ended his dominance sparked one of the greatest single seasons in NFL history. 9 months after tearing his ACL, Peterson came back and rushed for 2,097 yards, won the NFL MVP, and carried a broken roster to the playoffs, and came within 9 yards of breaking Eric Dickerson's all-time rushing record. It's a comeback season that's so absurd and so unbelievable that even now, more than a decade later, it still doesn't feel real. But to understand how it happened, we have to go back to the moment where it almost ended. It was December 24th, 2011 at FedEx Field, Week 16 of the NFL season. The Vikings were sitting at 3-12, playing for pride more than anything. But Adrian Peterson wasn't the kind of player who ever took his foot off of the gas. At just 26 years old, he was already one of the most feared running backs the league had ever seen. Built on speed and power and the kind of violence that made defenders think twice about tackling him. It was late in the third quarter and the Vikings were up by a field goal. Christian Ponder lined up under center and took the snap and proceeded to hand the ball to Peterson. This was supposed to be routine for him: explode through the hole, lower the shoulder, and fight for every inch. But this time, well, it was far from it. Redskins safety Dejan Gomes dove straight into Peterson's left knee and bent it in a way no human leg should ever bend. Peterson hit the ground instantly and clutched his knee as the crowd went silent. Players from both teams stood in shock while trainers sprinted out on the field, and for a moment, it felt like the entire stadium was holding its breath. Even if you weren't a Vikings fan, you could feel that sinking feeling in your stomach. The MRI later that night confirmed the worst: a torn ACL and a torn MCL, both in his left knee. The season was over, and for a running back whose entire game was built on explosion and burst, a lot of people thought his career might be over too. And honestly, it was hard to argue, because that same exact injury had already ended Hall of Fame careers in the past. The recovery timeline is usually a full year just to get back on the field, and even then, most players never return to who they were before. And that next morning, the headlines were brutal. But this is Adrian Peterson we're talking about. He doesn't listen to timelines, he doesn't care about what's supposed to happen, and he wasn't ready to let this be the end of his story. Because while everyone else was preparing for his downfall, Peterson was already preparing for something else. Not just survival and not just a comeback, he was preparing to make history.
Would it be smarter at all for you, given the time of your injury at the end of December and your surgery being at the end of December, to delay your comeback in your debut a few weeks into the season as opposed to being tunnel vision on week 1 for you?
For me, no. I'm not trying to encounter no delay.
6 days after the injury, AP was on an operating table in Birmingham, Alabama, with Dr. James Andrews repairing his shredded knee. A torn ACL and MCL is usually at least a year before you're even ready to think about playing again. And for a running back, where every cut and every burst decides your career, the odds were stacked completely against him. But from the moment that surgery was over, Peterson wasn't thinking about timelines, because in his mind, he was going to be ready for week 1. 2 weeks after the surgery, he already ditched the crutches. And a month later, he was already back in the weight room, grinding through workouts so intensely that trainers said it made them nervous just watching him. And then on September 9, 2012, just 8.5 months after tearing his ACL and his MCL, Adrian Peterson jogged out of the tunnel at Mall of America Field for the Vikings season opener against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, to put it simply, nobody knew what to expect. The coaching staff planned to limit his touches, fans were just hoping to see him moving around without hesitation. But Adrian Peterson had a very different plan. Early in the first quarter, Christian Ponder handed him the ball, Peterson planted on his repaired left knee, cut through the hole, and lowered his shoulder straight into a Jaguars defender. And although it wasn't a touchdown, in that moment, everybody watching knew Adrian Peterson was back, and he wasn't easing into anything. By the end of the game, Peterson had 17 carries for 84 yards and 2 touchdowns. And in the process, he helped the Vikings pull off a 26-23 win in overtime. 8 months removed from a major knee surgery, he wasn't just playing, he was dominating. Adrian Peterson was back, and he was about to have one of the greatest seasons the NFL had ever seen. Now, after week 1, people thought AP's comeback was already complete. I mean, he had 2 touchdowns, looked explosive, and helped the Vikings win. That alone would have been enough to make the story legendary. But that was just the beginning. Because by the middle of the season, it became clear this wasn't just a successful recovery, this was something we had never seen before. Because Peterson started ripping off 100-yard games like it was nothing. Week after week, he was shredding defenses that knew exactly what was coming, but it didn't matter. It started small at first, a couple 120-yard games, then 150, but by week 7, everything clicked. Peterson went on an absolute tear, 8 straight games of over 100 rushing yards. And in the NFL, where everyone said the passing game was king, AP was single-handedly bringing back the dominance of the ground game. And it wasn't just the volume of yards, it was how he was doing it, because these weren't just 3-yard chunks and grinded out drives, these were home runs. Peterson was breaking out runs of 40, 50, and even 80 yards almost weekly. You would blink and he'd already be in the end zone. The numbers were just ridiculous. Through the back half of the season, Peterson was averaging 6 yards per carry. That's the kind of efficiency you only see from backups who touch the ball 5 times a game. But Peterson, well, he was doing it 30 times a game on a surgically repaired knee. And then came the game that changed everything, Week 15 against the St. Louis Rams. You see, the Vikings needed a win to stay alive in the playoff race, and Peterson delivered one of the best games of his career. Early in the second quarter, he takes the handoff, hits that second level, and suddenly there's nothing but green grass ahead of him. 82 yards down the field, and by the time the safety even got close, Peterson was already crossing the goal line. He finished that night with 212 rushing yards, putting him at 1,812 on the season. And suddenly, everyone realized what was happening. Peterson wasn't just dominating anymore. In fact, he was chasing history. The question started to pop up. Could he beat Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing record of 2,105 yards? Nobody thought that was possible 9 months after knee surgery. Hell, nobody thought it was possible at all in today's NFL. But with 2 games left on the schedule, Peterson had a real shot. By week 16, the stage was set. The Vikings went on the road to face the Houston Texans, one of the league's best defenses at the time, and everyone expected him to finally slow down. But Peterson still ran for 86 hard-fought yards, and the Vikings pulled out a huge win, which set up the perfect finale. Because now, everything came down to week 17. Not only a chance to claim their spot in this year's postseason, but a chance for AP to break history. The date is December 30th, 2012, Mall of America Field. The Vikings were 9-6, clinging to their playoff hopes, and they were facing their division rival in the Green Bay Packers. The stakes could not have been any higher. If the Vikings won, they were in the playoffs. If they lost, their season was over. But for Adrian Peterson, there was something even bigger on the line. He was 208 yards away from breaking that record, a record that had stood untouched since 1984. And AP walked into the stadium with a chance to put together the greatest individual season the NFL had ever seen from a running back. And the crowd was electric from the very start. Every time he touched the ball, you could hear the tension building in that stadium. And on that very first drive, Peterson made it clear he wasn't going to hold anything back. He exploded through that offensive line, lowered his shoulder into a linebacker, and dragged him for an extra 5 yards. And as the game went on, the atmosphere inside the dome felt different. I mean, you could feel the weight of history building with every single carry. The Packers knew exactly what was coming. They stacked the box, they blitzed, and they swarmed, but none of it mattered. Peterson kept breaking tackles, kept bouncing off defenders, and kept piling up the yards. By the time the fourth quarter came around, the Vikings were in a fight for their season. The score was tied, and the clock was running down, and then came the moment. With less than 30 seconds left, the Vikings had the ball near midfield, and Christian Ponder handed it to Peterson one last time. AP took the handoff, he planted his repaired left knee, bounced it to the outside, and sprinted up the sideline. And by the time the Packers could drag him down, he picked up 22 yards and set the Vikings up for a game-winning field goal. Rookie kicker Blair Walsh drilled a 29-yarder to give the Vikings a 37-34 win and send them straight to the postseason. Peterson finished that game with 199 yards on 34 carries. It was one of the best performances of his career. But when the reporters gathered around him after the game, they had to break the bad news. He didn't break the record, he finished 9 yards short. But the truth is, you couldn't really be disappointed. I mean, if you think about it, a player comes back from a torn ACL and MCL in just 8 months. He rushes for 2,097 yards, the second most in NFL history. He led his team to the playoffs when everybody left them for dead. And he does it while falling just 9 yards shy of one of football's most unbreakable records. And in a way, what happened that day made the story even better. Because Adrian Peterson's 2012 season wasn't about chasing Eric Dickerson, it was about proving everybody wrong. And on that December night, in front of 64,000 screaming fans, he did exactly that. In a league built for quarterbacks, Adrian Peterson delivered a season so unbelievable that the NFL had no choice but to give him the MVP. And to this day, he's still the last non-quarterback to win the award. Because the numbers, they don't even feel real. 2,097 rushing yards, the second most in NFL history. 6 yards per carry, unheard of for someone touching the ball 30 times a game, and 13 touchdowns to boot. And a 10-6 record, dragging a Vikings team that most analysts left for dead all the way to the playoffs. 8 months earlier, the man couldn't even walk without crutches, and now he was carrying a franchise on a repaired knee. And for fans, not just in Minnesota, but everywhere, this season became one of the rare moments in sports you just don't forget. Because this wasn't just about football. This was about refusing to accept limits, about proving every expert, every timeline, and every doubt wrong. Peterson didn't just return from an injury, he rewrote what we thought was possible for the human body. And the beauty of it all, he didn't need that record. He didn't need the headlines saying Peterson breaks Dickerson's mark. He stood on that field after week 17, 9 yards short of immortality, and a smile stretched over his face. Because for him, the story was never about chasing somebody else's name in the record books. It was about winning, it was about proving himself correct, and it was about doing something the league had never seen before. Adrian Peterson didn't just give us one of the greatest seasons in NFL history. He gave us a story that will live on forever.